So welcome tonight to the library for our first Wednesday series. I got to tell you, today in my department head meeting, we have a meeting every Wednesday morning. We go around the room and relate what's happening in our departments. So it was a surprise to many in the room today that after the police chief mentioned some fugitives from justice with which he was dealing, that I would follow with some comments more or less along the same lines. So it got a lot of laughs today in the department head meeting. So this is our third lecture in our 8th season of First Wednesday Lectures. For those of you here for the first time, First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council and takes place, of course, the first Wednesday of the month, October through May, in libraries across the state, 9 of them to be exact. First, let me remind you, take a brochure home tonight. They're over there at the circulation desk, and it has the other lectures going on across the state. And if you see a talk that you might be interested in seeing here next year, go ahead and put it on the feedback form, which I hope you take tonight, and write that down, because we use that to plan our series. There are no tickets sold for this event. You're able to be here tonight to hear this talk, and so it's free, but it's not free to the library. We need to raise funds to have these speakers, and we do this through the Friends of the Library. So I hope that if you're not a member of the Friends of the Library, you will become a member so we continue these fine programs. The Friends do not do it alone. This little PowerPoint slideshow that we have done by the President, Mary Ide, shows some of the other sponsors who help us with these programs. I'll just mention them very quickly: Downs Racklin Martin, the Brattleboro Savings and Loan, Wyndham World Affairs Council of Vermont, the Vermont Country Store, and New Chapter, Inc. We owe special thanks tonight to the Vermont Department of Libraries for assisting. And I just want to mention that next month's lecture will be on the second Wednesday, just to confuse things, because the first Wednesday will be New Year's Day. And that will be Dartmouth Professor Annalise Orlick, whose topic will be "What if poor women ran the world?" And she tells the story of 9 African-American union maids in Las Vegas who challenged welfare cuts and built a long-lasting but vibrant anti-poverty program run by poor mothers. That'll be here at 7 p.m. on January 8th. Okay, now for our speaker. If you clicked on the link from my newsletter that went out Sunday and watched the introduction for Kevin by attorney and legal scholar Alan Dershowitz at the Martha's Vineyard Book Fest, please do not compare that, what I'm going to say, to his provocative statements. But I do urge you to watch that because it's well worth watching. Mine will be a more traditional introduction. A Boston native, Kevin Cullen is an author and Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who has written for the Boston Globe since 1985. At the Globe, he served as local, national, and foreign correspondent before becoming a columnist. He initially worked as the newspaper's law enforcement correspondent, and in 1987 won a Livingston Award for his portrait of an East Boston hoodlum. He spent several stints on the Spotlight team, the Globe's investigative unit, and was part of the team that in 1988 exposed the mobster James Whitey Bulger as an FBI informant. He spent more than 20 years covering the conflict in Northern Ireland, more than any other American journalist. He was described by the Irish Times as, quotes, the most informed American journalist on Irish affairs, while the media critic at the Independent of London called him the most astute observer of Irish affairs in the American media. After a year in Dublin, he moved to London to serve as the Globe's chief European correspondent, covering the war in the former Yugoslavia. He reported from more than 20 countries across Europe. In 2001, after 4 years abroad, he returned to Boston and joined the Globe's investigative team, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 2003 for exposing the cover of sexual abuse of minors by Roman Catholic priests. In 2007, he was promoted to Metro columnist and has since won twice the Batten Medal from the American Society of Newspaper Editors. He is the only person to win that award twice. Mr. Cullen has been a frequent commentator on National Public Radio, the BBC, and RTE, Ireland's national broadcaster. Cullen is the author, with Shelley Murphy, of the New York Times bestseller, Whitey Bulger, America's Most Wanted Gangster, and the Manhunt That Brought Him to Justice, which will be sold after the talk tonight at the table here by Everyone's Books. Please welcome Kevin Cullen.
Thank you, Jerry. Is this on? I feel like Madonna. I need to vamp. Thank you for coming out tonight. This is an impressive showing on a Wednesday night in early December, and it can't be for me. When I was asked to come here by the great people at the Department of Humanities, they didn't even finish the question before I said, "When do you want me?" My family spends a bit of time in Vermont, mostly in the Upper Valley, and I'm actually in the process right now of convincing my wife, the Mad Martha, to move up here. I'm done with the city, and we are extremely fond of Vermont. And until last year, my son was a student at UVM, and then he kind of figured out you had to actually open a book. So he's no longer there. But it's wonderful to be in Brattleboro. I want to start talking about the book by explaining why we wrote the book. I wish Shelley was here with me. Shelley Murphy, my co-author and my work wife, and one of my oldest friends. We've covered this guy about as long as anybody. I don't think anybody's covered it longer than the two of us put together. And she grew up in Savin Hill, which is right next to South Boston. It's a section of Dorchester that we fondly call Stab and Kill. But the only reason, begin with this premise, the only reason Whitey Bulger, the most famous criminal or gangster, to come out of South Boston was actually in South Boston. It was because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Because part of the New Deal was, first time it ever happened, was public housing. And there was a young, up-and-coming congressman who helped push this through a very, very skeptical Congress at the time. His name was John McCormick. And he was the congressman in South Boston. And of course, there had to be a quid pro quo, so when John McCormick and a number of other congressmen got this through Congress, FDR says, well, what do you want? So somebody said this, the guy in Ohio wanted this, the guy in Iowa wanted farm subsidies, and John McCormick wanted a public housing project. And so it goes up there. And Whitey Bulger and his family, who had nothing to do with South Boston, move into that project in 1938. And Whitey, from the very beginning, did not like being poor. It's very interesting. One of the things, there are many different narrative arcs in the book, but one of them is the way that Whitey looks at life and the way his brother Bill, the famous politician, who became the longest-serving president of the Massachusetts State Senate, Bill Bulger, the way they look at the same thing and what they see. And Bill Bulger remembers life in the project as sort of idyllic. Now, let's face it, the Old Colony project, the Old Colony and the Old Harbor project where Whitey grew up, are the only housing projects in America with ocean views. They look out over Dorchester Bay. It's unbelievable. It was, you have to understand in that culture, what it was like for a family like the Bulgers to land in there and have 3 bedrooms with 6 kids. And the father, who Whitey was named after, his name was James, and he preferred to be called Jimmy. He did not like Whitey until very recently. I'll end that later. But his father, James, actually lost his arm when he was about 15 years old, screwing around on railroad cars actually outside of Boston. And at that time, there really wasn't much of a market for one-armed laborers. So James Bulger was very poor, had trouble getting work, had trouble keeping work, and the family was very poor. That's why they moved into the project. And Whitey didn't like being poor. As Billy recalled the nobility of being poor, Whitey was like, screw this, I don't want to be poor. So by the time Whitey was about 13 or 14, he was a professional thief. He started stealing things. In Southie, they called it tailgating. The best thing I could compare it to is sort of the young thieves in Oliver Twist that just went out there. And these kids went out there and they stole stuff off the back of trucks. They went down to the docks. They took what they could. They sold what they could. And by the time Whitey was a teenager, in the housing project that he grew up in South Boston, nobody had cars. Whitey had a car. And what did he do with the car? Well, when he wasn't driving around with his girlfriend, the Jane Mansfield lookalike, Jackie McAuliffe, he was driving around looking for opportunities, not opportunities of crime, opportunities of old ladies. And whenever he saw an old lady trudging down back to the project with the groceries from Broadway, he would pull his car over. It was an Oldsmobile convertible. And he'd jump out, he'd open the door, and then gallantly say, "Mrs. Moakley, jump in, I'll take you home." Now, Mrs. Moakley was one of the recipients of this more often than other. Her son, Joe Moakley, grew up to be a congressman, and the courthouse where Whitey was just tried and convicted and sentenced to life in prison is named after Joe Moakley. So it's a small world in Boston, but you know that. So Whitey was, at a very young age, was extremely conscious of what he was doing. He knew he was going to be a criminal. And yet he knew to be a successful criminal in the neighborhood, in the culture, the milieu he grew up in, you couldn't be just feared, you had to be liked. You had to be a cut above. And so when I talked to a lot of the old, back in the 80s, when we did the original Bulger Brothers project, I talked to an awful lot of the old ladies, Mrs. Dame, Sally Dame, and Ann McCurry, and all these old ladies in the project. And they all told me the same thing. They would go out, and they called it stoop talking. On a summer night in the project, they'd stand on the stoops, and things were very close. I mean, everything was on top of each other. And they would talk to each other, and they'd yell, you know, from here to the back where Danny is or something. They'd just yell at each other and talk. And eventually, on a summer night, somebody said, "That Jimmy Bulger, he's a hoodlum, he's a gangster." And all the old ladies would say, "Hey, now wait a minute. Jimmy Bulger drove me home from the grocery store 3 weeks ago. He's a lovely young man." And Whitey knew exactly what he was doing. And so he had all the old ladies in the project had Whitey's back. Now, as happened in an awful lot of the white working class neighborhoods of Boston, when you move from being a thief, the next step up, sort of like going to graduate school, is bank robbery. And Whitey, and we were able to find, we actually found some of the guys that he hooked on with, the crew, and he went to a very specific place in the theater district in Boston where bank robbers hung out. And he got into a crew, did a number of bank robberies, lived large, loved it. You know, went to Miami, brought the beautiful Jackie with him, spent, I think he said in 1 year, this is 1954 or 55, he spent $25,000. That's a lot of money back then. And he was just blowing it on hotels, staying at the finest hotels in Miami, wherever they would be on the run. And, but eventually he got caught. And the one thing that Shelley and I found in our research, because Whitey is obsessed with not being a rat. I'm not an informant, I'm not a rat. But we found records in his prison file that was actually kept. Anybody that does, and Whitey did time in Alcatraz, anybody that did time in Alcatraz, their entire prison file is put in the National Archives in San Bruno. And Shelley went out there and brought the whole thing back. It was just unbelievable. Got everything on a disc, and then we worked, you know, part of the book, we worked off that. And we found out, looking in that Whitey gave up his friends in the bank robberies. The guy that wasn't a rat was a rat as far back as 1956. Now, he tried to put it into some people that he was doing it to save his girlfriend, Jackie, because she was with them when they did some bank jobs in Indiana. And she was with them, but she really wasn't going to be charged with anything. That was just, what was really intriguing, the way the FBI agent in 1956 wrote it. He said that Bulger does not want to be identified as the informant, or the claimant in this case, so we're going to say the girlfriend identified them. So Jackie provided the identification of his cohorts, and he just went through, and obviously this was supposed to be secret, and then he went and took his medicine, which at the time was a pretty stiff sentence. You have to understand, back in the 40s, 50s, bank robbery was the biggest issue in crime in America, and people got pretty stiff sentences. He pled guilty, and he got 20 years. And his first, he was sent to Alcatraz. He was sent to Atlanta. the penitentiary down there. And we found a lot of his letters that were in his prison file, and he was complaining. Whitey was out of his mind when he went to Atlanta because they put him in with, he was in with 7 other guys in a cell, 8 guys in a cell. And he complained in a letter. He said, all they talk about is broads, cars, and money. And Whitey was way above that. He didn't want to talk about it. He thought he was far, far higher than that class. And so he actually went to the prison infirmary and basically suggested him that he was mentally unstable. And he got a single cell out of basically saying he was mentally unstable. The other thing Whitey did that was very formative in that time in Atlanta, when he was doing 20 years for bank robberies, he volunteered for an experiment. And he was told it was a drug experiment that would help cure schizophrenia. What he didn't know, and what fed his sort of anti-government, that's why I can do what I want to do mentality, is that the CIA funded this project. And it was this completely harebrained Cold War nut job idea that if you give people LSD, they will then tell you anything they want. Because nobody knew what LSD was back then. They didn't have an idea. It had only been discovered I think, in Switzerland a few years before. So Whitey goes, okay, sure, if I get some time off my sentence. So he was injected with LSD, and like a number of other people. And the other thing that Shelley and I found was, I did most of the research on this issue. I was stunned that I just assumed that they used prison inmates as guinea pigs. It was actually very unusual. The only reason the Atlanta inmates were used is because the head of the project for the CIA was a guy that worked at Emory University in Atlanta. So they just said, well, okay, we'll go use the prison inmates there. But the vast majority of guinea pigs, human guinea pigs in that project, were medical students and actual doctors. All over, particularly in Boston and particularly in San Francisco. That might be why we all think alike when in those two places, I don't know. But Whitey actually had a psychotic reaction to it. He really went, he had horrible night tremors, he went crazy for a short period of time. He was hospitalized for quite a long time. And to this day, he maintains, and I don't think it's a scam. A lot of what Whitey does is a scam. He maintains he's never had a good night's sleep since then. And it really made him a nocturnal character. He really stayed up most nights and slept through most days. And for some reason, that seemed to control his nightmares better than having a normal day of staying up during the day and sleeping during the night. So the other thing that Whitey did while he was in Atlanta, and I think it was very telling, is that he got involved in an escape attempt, even though he didn't want to escape. But one thing Whitey was very susceptible to was peer pressure by other criminals. As much as he thinks he's his own guy, we found throughout his life he would get in trouble when somebody would say, let's do this, and he could not say no. And in this case, he got involved in a real harebrained scheme to get out of Atlanta, and they shipped him off to Alcatraz. Now, the other thing we found in this whole period is that this is when Bill Bulger, his younger brother by 4 years, really becomes his advocate. Bill was just entering Boston College Law School when Whitey got sentenced to prison. And it was devastating to Whitey, to Billy, it was devastating to the whole family because Whitey was the only bad guy in the family. And Billy took it upon himself to sort of, I'm going to help my brother, I'm going to be his advocate. And he very quickly put together an extraordinary coalition of very influential people. The first person he went to help his brother was Bob Drinan. You may remember that name. He's a Jesuit priest who at the time was the dean of the Boston College Law School and then became not only a congressman, but the first congressman to call for the impeachment of Richard Nixon until the Pope told him to screw and leave the job. That's another story. But so Bob Drinan began writing letters to Whitey, and they became pen pals, for lack of a better term. But it went much deeper than that. When Whitey applied for parole, and it took him 3 times to get it, Bob Drinan, who was the dean of the Boston College Law School, was his parole advisor. Basically, he said, I'm vouching for this guy. And the other person that Billy was able to pull in to help Whitey, his brother, was that congressman that got them that place in the project in the first place, John McCormick, who by this time was the Speaker of the House. He was the most powerful congressman in America. And we found these letters in which John McCormick was writing the director of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons to please take care of Jim Bulger. He comes from a fine family, blah, 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 and all this stuff. And one thing we were able to find is that at McCormick's insistence, the director of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons at that time took a plane from Washington to San Francisco, went down to Pier 33, got on that ferry called the Warden Johnson, went out to the island of Alcatraz, sat down at a table across from Whitey Bulger and said, "Hey, Jimmy, how they treat you?" Now, Whitey was like a penny ante bank robber. He was nobody special. In fact, at the time we found, when Shelley and I went through the 400 inmates who were at Alcatraz, I think it was 300 at the time, there were 2 other Whiteys. He wasn't even the only Whitey. He was the 3rd Whitey at Alcatraz, and he had the director of the Bureau of Prisons out there advocating for him, worried about him. And so Whitey learned something very important from that era. And in that, we called it, the 3rd chapter of the book is called The University of Alcatraz, because Whitey used his time at Alcatraz to read a book every day. It was like, and he treated Alcatraz the rest of his life the way you and I might regard our alma mater. The only thing that was missing was on the back of his Malibu was like this Alcatraz, like it was this school he went to. And Whitey learned, but the way his brother helped him, that the perception of power and influence was just as important as the actual exercise of that. And Whitey's criminal career would mirror that, because he didn't kill, I think he killed probably about 40 people. If you go in Southie, most people think he killed about 300 people. But it was just the mentality that he was out there doing all these things. But the other thing that came out of that era, that period, is that Billy Bulger, who was an emerging politician at the time, was elected to the House of Representatives in 1960. He was so invested in his brother's rehabilitation that I believe, if you look forward to this present day, he was absolutely either disingenuous about the whole thing or completely deluded about how bad his brother was. Because I remember in the middle of the research process, when we were going through all these things, Shelley turned to me and said, there's a letter from Bill to his brother about how we want you to get better and go straight. And Whitey writing back about, I'm tired of being the black sheep and I'm tired of bringing shame to my family. I want to go straight when I get out. And Shelley said, if you didn't know who this guy is, you'd be pulling for him. But the other thing we found out by the research we did is that Whitey lasted in the straight world for about a year. He worked construction. He actually worked construction with my cousin John Connor from South Boston, who was one of the greatest hockey players, American hockey players, 2-time Beanpot MVP from Boston College. And that's the other thing about, I'm growing up hearing all this stuff, that I was aware of Whitey Bulger probably when I was like 9 years old because of my cousin. And so Billy gets Whitey 2 jobs. One, basically a no-show job as a custodian at the Suffolk County Courthouse, because where would you put a paroled bank robber but put him in the courthouse and give him the keys? Makes sense to me. But he also got him a job in construction, which he really did work. And he worked it about a year, and he basically said, screw this. I'm not getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning working hard every day. Whitey Bulger wanted to steal things. He never wanted to work. And if you look at his whole criminal career, even when it came down to burying the bodies, he let other people do that. He killed them. Somebody else had to take their teeth out and bury them. He was lazy. He wanted to steal. So he went right back into the game. In the later 60s, probably 68, 67, 68, he got involved with the Colleen gang. And the Colleens were the sort of mainstream, they ran the mob in Southie. It was mostly bookmaking. It wasn't like a lot of violent, crazy stuff. They'd beat you up and steal, if you weren't paying them and all that. But they were kind of separate. The Mafia had its own thing in the North End in different parts of Boston. The Southie guys were just Southie. and it was bookies. And I was when I was a kid, my Uncle Wooly was a longshoreman, and sometimes when you get half in the rapid, they'd send me down on Sunday nights to get him back. And I'm like 8 years old, I'm bringing my Uncle Wooly back home because he's hammered. And, you know, but even as a kid, I was aware every bar room in Southie, when you walked in, the last guy in the bar, sitting as far away from the doors, usually with his back to it, was the bookie. And it was like, today they're called lottery machines, you know, or Keno. But back then it was a bookie. And so that's where the Southie guys made the money. Now, Whitey got involved basically as muscle. He was the guy that was going to be an enforcer if people weren't paying and everything. But what the other thing I should have said before, that one of the things that really helped Whitey when he was locked up is there was a gang war in Boston. And about 60 guys were killed, murdered. A number of people were taken off the street and charged with certain murder zones. So when he came out of prison, the killing had stopped, and there was this sort of barren landscape. And he was able to rise very, very quickly. And what happened in the late 60s, early 70s was a much smaller internecine gang war in South Boston, in which these guys called the Mullins, they hung out in a place in the City Point section of Southie that was one of these squares named after a guy named Mullen, who I think he got killed in the World War I. So they called themselves the Mullins. And they were all Vietnam vets, and they came back incredibly disillusioned with everything. And their attitude was, we interviewed a number of them, including Pat Nee, who once hit up here in Vermont, but I can't talk about that. And Pat explained that, you know, they'd spent, you know, 2 to 4 years in the jungles fighting the Viet Cong, and they weren't going to be told what to do by a bunch of old gangsters like Whitey Bulger and the Colleens. So what they did is they ran up these incredible debts gambling. As Pat said, he goes, we had no intention of paying them off. And he goes, I owed about 50 grand when the war started, he said. And there was a war. And they had a little war in Southie and a number of people. And Whitey started killing people. As far as we know, that's when his killing began. And one of the killings, there was a kid named, there's a guy named Paulie McGonigal. And he was the titular head of the Mullins, even though they didn't have like a hierarchical group like the Colleens or even the Mafia. And Paulie Whitey says, I'm going to kill Paulie, and that will end the thing. So he goes looking for Paulie, and he sees him like pulled up like next to him right in a street in South Boston. So he takes out and he shoots him right in the face. He's in the car next to him, and as soon as he fired the bullet, he said, oh shit, that's not Paulie, that's Donnie, his brother. So he killed the brother. And he raced from there back to Savin Hill in Dorchester, where his mentor, Billy O'Sullivan, was. And there was another guy that was in the room that recounted the story to us, is that, you know, Billy said, don't worry, Whitey goes, I killed the wrong guy. And Whitey like prided himself in the way he did things, and Jesus, I killed the wrong guy. And Billy O'Sullivan said to Whitey, he said, Donnie was a very heavy smoker. He would have died eventually anyway. How do you want your pork chops? So that gang war went on, and the Mullins eventually, through sheer dint of, they didn't care. They were different. They were like you said, they were all Vietnam vets. They were like crazy. They didn't care about what would happen to them or any, and so they were winning. And they ended up killing Donnie Colleen, the leader of the gang, the other gang, by luring him out. He lived in suburban Boston and Framingham, and they lured him out during his the birthday party for his 4-year-old son. And they made a call and said, we need to talk to you, and can you come out? And they made the call from somewhere else, and when he came outside to get in the car, they were waiting there, they shot him, they killed him. And so they're winning. Now here's the genius of Whitey Bulger. He knows at this point his group is losing. They just lost their leader. So what he did, and when he was in prison, he studied, like, he was fascinated with warfare, particularly the way Asians, particularly in China, you know, 1,000 years ago, the way the Chinese fought their wars. And he was very fascinated on this stuff. And he actually read an awful lot of Machiavelli. And my line on that is, most of the people he associated with, if you ask them, do you know who Machiavelli is? They said, yeah, I think he runs with the Cleveland crew. Whitey was a little above that. He had read The Prince. He understood how to divide and conquer. He understood how to get people to do his dirty work. He understood, particularly when it came to counterinsurgency, how to get in there before anybody else did. So what he did when his side was losing, he went to Howie Winter, and Howie cooperated with us for the book, sat with us and talked to us at length. And Howie said that he just showed up, he had never met him before, and said, I'm Jimmy Bulger, you know me, I'm with the Colleens in Southie, and we need to end this war, and you're the guy to end it. And that played to Howie. Now, Howie ran the Winter Hill Gang in neighboring Somerville, just outside the city of Boston, which was actually the biggest non-mafia organized crime group in Boston. They had tentacles all over eastern Massachusetts. And as we show in the book, they were actually a creation of the FBI. The FBI, as far back in the 60s, was playing God and deciding who would win these gang wars. And they were not only using guys as informants, they were helping their guys target people and murder people. And we have a case in there in which Buddy McLean, who was the leader of the Winter Hill Gang before Howie Winter, actually murdered a guy, an FBI informant, after the FBI agent told him, my informant's going to show up here, he's working against you guys. So he kills him, and then until the heat died down, he stayed in the FBI agent's house for like 3 days. I mean, that's how bad it was. And that, like I said, that was in the 60s. So now, here we are in the 70s, and Howie's like, you know, Howie said to us, I love the way he put it, he goes, you know what, if I'm going to go out and get shit-faced and have like some beers, I'd rather go out with the Mullins guys. But I knew Whitey would make money for me, because he didn't drink a lot. And he goes, Kevin, he was in Alcatraz. And I'm looking at Howie telling me that. It's like, if Howie was like a CEO of, you know, an accounting firm or something, it's like, he went to Wharton. Okay, Howie. So Howie's like trying to defend the whole thing. He goes, he's a very impressive guy. And I go, I'm sure he was. So Howie decides, and they have this, we called it the Wise Guy Versailles. It happened in a place called Chandler's in the south end of Boston, which was this, only Marty Scorsese could do it well. It was this god-awful, horrible, like, you know, brass rails and deep wood and you know, cheap Tiffany lamps, and like the glasses hung over there, and everybody's smoking, and everybody's got leather jackets, and oh my God, you know, the guys are kissing guys on the cheeks, the women are kissing everybody, everybody's smoking. That's Chandler's. But in the morning, there was nobody there. So on one morning in 1972, they bring everybody in, and Howie gets up and decides, this is how it's going to be. You guys are all good kids. No more war. You're all going to make money together. And so the Mullins, who thought they were winning, find out that they lost everything. Whitey's in charge. And at that breakfast, Pat Nee, who talked to us at lunch for the book, said that I was sitting next to Tommy King. And Tommy leans over to me when he realizes where this is going and says, we should have killed Whitey when we had the chance. Now, Tommy King was not the brightest guy in the world. And he was one of these guys that would punch first and shoot first and ask questions later. But he was absolutely right about that. Tommy knew exactly what's going on. So fast forward a year later, Whitey goes out and kills Paulie McGonigal, the head of the Mullins, supposedly his partner now, buries him down by a beach in Dorchester, and then sets about, all of a sudden, he gets a call from John Conley, an FBI agent who had grown up in the same housing project as him, who was a protege of his brother Billy, who wanted to do. Conley was motivated on many different levels. First of all, at that time, and to some extent today, FBI agents get ahead, get promotions, get raises, not by making cases, but by making informants. And Whitey Bulger was considered a gangster of reputation. And at the time, the FBI was obsessed with getting the mafia. That was a national priority, national policy. The problem with national policies is they don't take into account regional differences. And in Boston, the Irish guys were more murderous than the Italians. The Italians were basically the Massachusetts lottery. They were mostly making money. They killed people, no question. I mean, they're a violent, horrible group. But the Irish guys killed in Boston, killed more often. And frankly, what we found out by the FBI's own tapes is that by the late 70s, early 80s, the FBI, the mafia had so many, they had gone soft that they were actually subcontracting hits, contract murders, to the Irish. And they weren't happy about it. So Connolly is working an angle. He's working many angles. He's trying to make himself look good and all that stuff, but he's also trying to protect Whitey Bulger because he's very loyal to the Bulger family. And he knows as long as Bulger's an FBI informant, the FBI, the premier law enforcement agency, and at the time, no organized crime case could be made without the FBI imprimatur. He knew as long as Whitey was one of their informants, they would never prosecute him. And he was right. But it got a lot worse than that. So he has this deal, and they agree to do it, blah, blah, blah. And the first thing Whitey decides to do after he's a protected informant is to kill Tommy King. And so he, you know, this is another, like, only Marty Scorsese could do it in film. They go up to Tommy and say, listen, we're going to kill Suitcase Fiddler. And he was like a hood from Charlestown. They go, and Tommy's go, oh, great, yeah, okay. He goes, so we'll meet down the nursing home, we'll go up there, and they meet there at the arranged time, and there's like a hit team. And, you know, Whitey's driving, Johnny Martirano's in the back seat, and you never sit behind Johnny Martirano, but like I said, Tommy King wasn't the brightest guy in the world. So then, and Stevie Fleming hands out all the guns to all the hit guys, you know. And they hit, here's a gun for you, here's a gun for you, and here's a gun for you. They give Tommy King a gun. And of course, it's loaded with blanks. But Tommy didn't know that because he was not a member of Mensa. And as they drove to the hit, Johnny Martirano said that he tapped, Tommy King tapped on his, he goes, I have a bulletproof vest, maybe I'll get a chance to use it. And the bulletproof vest actually might have been useful for Tommy that night had he worn it on his head. Because at that moment, now it's broad daylight on it, they're driving and John Martirano leans forward and just shoots him in the back of the head. He's gone. And then they prop him up, they put the baseball cap down so he looks like he's sleeping, and they drive down and they're going down to basically the marshland in Quincy to bury him. And John, as they're about to turn around, there's a Dunkin' Donuts at the end of Quincy Shore Drive where Johnny Martirano goes, oh Jesus, I did not put, he goes, Jimmy, meaning Whitey Bulger, you got to pull over there. I have a bet, I got to put a bet down. There's a horse at Hialeah. They pull into the Dunkin' Donuts with Tommy King like this, and John Martirano gets out and places a bet. And then they go bury him. But this is, I mean, I don't mean to be funny, but it is funny about how ridiculous these guys are, about how venal they are, how lack of any human emotion that you and I might feel in this. They are absolute sociopaths. And so they bury Tommy King, and he stays there for 20-odd years. Now, Whitey goes on his merry way after that. He's protected as an informant. He does a number of things. One of the things he does is really step up his involvement with the IRA. And he had been sending stuff over like in very small shipments before, but then he got very, very involved. And we have a whole chapter about the IRA thing, which was just incredible stuff because Joe Cahill was the founder of the Provisional IRA. And I knew Joe. I covered Northern Ireland for a long time. I knew him pretty well. I spent time with him. But I never knew about this until years after his death when some gangsters that were very involved, and then I talked to a couple of IRA guys who confirmed all of it, is that Cahill came over here a number of times, and he had killed he was involved in the murder of a policeman in Belfast in the 40s, and he could not come in. He was lucky he dodged the hangman's noose, actually, and it's something the British regretted for many years after that. And Joe could not come into America, but he could go into Canada. Canada did not bar him from going. So what they did is he came to Boston 4 times, and he did it all the same way. The gangsters in Boston would tell the IRA guys in Belfast when to bring Joe to Toronto, usually Toronto, but sometimes Montreal. And in one case, it was Montreal. And what they did is they would rent a bus, which was not unusual. I was on one of these buses from Malden, which is near Boston. And Bruins fans, Boston Bruins fans, would go up to go see the Bruins play, either the Maple Leafs in Toronto or more often it was the Canadiens in Montreal. And what they would do is after the game, guys would buck up, and whoever won got to stay like 4 extra days in Montreal and get loaded. And their spots on the bus were taken by Joe Cahill and 3 other IRA volunteers. And they would come down to Boston, and in this case, very specifically, they were organizing a big weapons plot. And Whitey was able to pull this off. And he ended up being involved, in the biggest weapons shipment ever to the IRA, but it was actually compromised, ironically, by an informant in Ireland. But then Whitey killed a guy here in Boston that he thought was the informant, but he wasn't. So you had an informant killing an informant when the other informant was like, oh, geez. It just shows how dirty all this stuff is. And, I'd like to open it up very soon to questions. And in the middle of this, I mean, the extent of the FBI's corruption, even though this is like titularly or described as a biography of Whitey Bulger, it is, but it's as much about the corruption of the FBI, the institutional corruption of the FBI. Whitey Bulger was protected at the highest levels of the FBI. And when he was involved in the murder of a legitimate businessman in Oklahoma in 1981, there were honest FBI agents in Oklahoma who were trying to solve that murder, and they were lied to by agents in Boston and by people in Washington, because Whitey was used as an informant against the mafia, even though he was not that good of an informant. He was just being protected by his homeboy from Southie, John Conley. And I must say that about 4 weeks ago, I was in Washington, and I was walking down Pennsylvania Ave, and I walked by the FBI building, the J. Edgar Hoover building, and to see that guy's name still on the wall really repulsed me. Because if you want to get back to where the corruption began in this whole case, it wasn't this local hood or protected by the local FBI agent. It was J. Edgar Hoover didn't do anything on the level. Whether it was going after Martin Luther King or going after political activists in the 60s, everything was not on the level. And it was the same thing with this. And that's why FBI agents were getting people murdered in the 60s. And so what progressed to Whitey Bulger? Whitey Bulger didn't happen in a vacuum. It's institutional corruption. And the other thing I will say before I open it up to questions, if you read the book, and I hope you do, the FBI has not changed one iota. Culturally, it is the same organization that protected Whitey Bulger and enabled him to murder people. Now, about 2 years ago, I got a call from a state cop I know. And the funny thing, he was very involved in the Bulger case. And when one of the things that it is in the book about, in 1988, when I was part of that Globe team, an FBI agent called me. His name is Tom Daly. He was part of the organized crime squad. He said, listen, I know you're working on that thing. We know what you're going to do. You're going to say Whitey's an informant for us. It's not true. I said, well, Tom, we know it's true. We had confirmed it at levels he wouldn't even be aware of. He says, Kevin, if you put that in the paper, he will murder you. He will kill you. And I said, he goes, you live there. And I lived in South Boston. And so I hung up the phone. I changed my pants. And my Jerry O'Neill, the editor of the Spotlight team at the time, told me, write a contemporaneous memo, what happened, what he said, blah, blah, blah. So I did that. And then I called 3 people who I trusted inherently. Bobby Long, a detective lieutenant with the Massachusetts State Police who had been trying to take Bulger off the street. Paul Brown, at the time he was the assistant special agent in charge of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration in Boston. Same thing, trying to get Bulger off the street. And a great cop, a Boston cop named Frank DeWan, whose career was ruined by going after Whitey Bulger because there were so many cops in Boston on the take for Bulger. They hated Frank. And I just told them all, I said, you know, I don't think anything's going to happen, but you guys need to know about this. And I put them on notice. And then we kind of came to the conclusion that it wasn't Whitey wasn't going to kill me. Whitey had not been that, he was too smart to do something like that. And the other thing is, if the FBI was really serious about it, it would have been a formal notification. We'd actually written about this 2 or 3 years prior. I was part of that team that did this, how they had to warn these like hoodlums who the mafia was going to kill when they had the bugs up and they knew they were going to be killed. So, but this is classically Boston. Jack Driscoll, the editor of the Globe, brings me and goes, Kevin, I think you and Martha, my wife, you really should move out of South Boston just for temporarily. Because we don't know, somebody might do something, somebody might break a window, we don't want, okay, we'll do that. So they moved me 9 stops down the red line. I moved from South Boston to Harvard Square because I said, he'll never find us here. And then, fast forward 10 years later, I was based in London. I was the London bureau chief, and I actually had to come back and testify to that whole thing. And the agent, Tom Daly, would not take the stand. And the government would not put him on the stand because he would have perjured himself. And they would have had to put him in jail. And that would have screwed up the Justice Department's whole narrative, which was it was one bad agent, John Conley, protected by one bad supervisor, John Morris. The Justice Department went out of its way to minimize. It's not just the Bulge. They do this in all the cases. Whenever somebody from the government gets with their hand caught in the cookie jar, it's one bad guy, and one bad guy has to do the time. And the Justice Department, one of the most despicable things you'll see in the book is that the Justice Department, when their hand was forced, and I like to say large part by what we did at the Boston Globe in the 80s, and forced this. And one of the real heroes in all this was Judge Mark Wolf, who forced the FBI to admit what they were doing. And he did that in 1999 with his incredible 661-page opus that laid it all out. And, you know, Judge Wolf at the time said he identified at least a dozen FBI agents and supervisors who were engaged in what he considered criminal conduct. And to this day, John Conley is the only guy that ever went to jail. John Morris, the supervisor, who became a witness for the government, admitted he got people killed. Not only did he not do any jail time, he kept his pension. John Conley, convicted of murder, doing 40 years in Miami right now, kept his pension. The FBI and the Justice Department have absolutely clouded themselves and shrouded themselves in shame and ignominy. And it hasn't gone away because Whitey Bulger was convicted and sentenced to 2 life terms. Not at all. And the way the Justice Department treated the victims of Whitey Bulger repulsed me. It should repulse anybody in this room. Because on one hand, they put up these people, absolute horrible murderers, thieves, scumbags, and they testified against Bulger about all his criminal activity. And then when the families sued, now most of the families were thrown out, their cases were thrown out on these specious grounds. I don't know if you know that if the government screws you over, you better get to court very quickly, because they will decide when the clock starts ticking. You have 2 years after you should know that the government screwed you over before you can sue them. And these families who had loved ones murdered by Whitey Bulger with the connivance and active complicity of the FBI, most of them get nothing. Not that money should be the measurement of any of this, but the way that the Justice Department fought these people. There was a wonderful jurist in this case, Judge Reggie Lindsay. And I've written about Reggie at great length. I think Reggie got this at a level that a lot of people in Boston couldn't. Reggie grew up in the Jim Crow South. He was an African American. And he had a very hard life. And he was confined to a wheelchair. And he not only became an accomplished lawyer, he became, a federal judge. I remember sitting in the courtroom when Justice Department lawyers got up there and tried to besmirch the Donahue family. Michael Donahue was murdered by Whitey Bulger. He was a truck driver who gave a ride home to somebody who had tried to turn Whitey in. And the FBI went and told Whitey that this guy Halloran was trying to turn him in. So Whitey decides to kill Halloran. He didn't care that Michael Donahue was giving him a ride home at the time. So Michael Donahue's murdered, leaves a wife and 3 young boys. And these Justice Department lawyers got up at this hearing, and they had to go through this. Instead of settling with the people, which Judge Lindsay had suggested, he said, sort of like the 9/11 fund, sort of like the Archdiocese of Boston, settling with the victims that were sexually abused by priests. Create this fund, let's end this, and let's just go. And they wouldn't take Judge Lindsay's advice. They fought it tooth and nail. And in the case of the Donahue family, Pat Donahue got up there and was asked to talk about the Justice Department took it to tell us about your relationship with your husband. And they started going through this, you moved out of Dorchester after your family, after your husband was killed. And she goes, yes, that's true. And the lawyer turned to a Justice Department lawyer and said, and you did it, didn't you, because blacks started moving on your street? Now, I've known the Donahue family for 20-something years. I know for Tommy Donahue he's the only white kid on an all-black darts team. All his neighbors are black and Asian. And he sat there and watched these Justice Department lawyers who got flown up from Washington, who stayed in the Intercontinental Hotel, who didn't know anything about this case, who didn't know any of these families, but knew that to stand in Boston and accuse a white Irish Catholic family of racism, they knew the currency in that. But I looked at Judge Lindsay, and Judge Lindsay looked disgusted at that Justice Department lawyer. And unfortunately, Judge Lindsay died shortly after that. It was one of the conversations I always wanted to hear. I wanted to ask him what he thought of what they did to Pat Donahue. Because Pat Donahue is not a racist. Far from it. Her family they moved to Randolph, as she said, because they couldn't afford their house in Dorchester anymore. But they moved back to Dorchester. The entire family lives in a triple-decker. They're the only white family on their street. And they listened to some Justice Department lawyer defending the murder of innocent people, accuse her of being a racist. That's our Justice Department. But I'm going to climb off my soapbox right now and open this to questions.
We have a microphone, so if you would wait till you get a microphone, then everybody will hear you.
Is that God? Is that Bernie Sanders? Yes, ma'am.
I worked at UMass Amherst for many years,
I
including...
graduated from UMass Amherst.
I know you did. I met you there.
I thought they had standards until they let me in.
Well, including during the Billy Bulger presidency years. And I've always wondered when he refused...
You're like Larry Bud Melman from the Letterman show. You're going like this and keep it right there.
When Billy Bulger refused to testify at the congressional hearings, have you ever seen or heard anything that would make you think that he had been in touch with his brother or in communication or knew where his brother was all those years?
Well, he did admit that he was in touch with him at least once. And that he talked to him while he was on the run. I'd be surprised if they only talked once, to be honest. I have nothing to back that up except my horrible mind of conspiracies. But as I said earlier, Billy, and I did a piece in the Globe magazine about a month ago about this, Billy was an enabler. That's the most generous thing I can say about him. Did he know that his brother was murdering people? I think he'd have to be a fool not to know that. Now, was he able to justify it? Said these are all the criminals he killed? But this is the other thing about Whitey, how loyal he was to his family. He murdered somebody right next door to his brother's house. He was murdering people 200 feet from his brother's house on East 3rd Street and burying them in the cellar. That's how loyal he was to his brother. I think Billy has an awful lot to answer for. Now, I don't buy the analogy of Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, how the brother turned in his brother. I think that was a little different circumstance. But I do think that, to me, it's only, when you look back over the continuum of this, that it took until 1988, when we did this big takeout 4-part series about the Bulger brothers. There was this incredible deference that you couldn't say that by the way, the Senate president's brother is a murderer and a gangster. It was considered bad form. I compared it to, and it's something I spent a lot of my life on, the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. The deference toward the bishops, the deference towards authority, and the reaction of the bishops in the light of this stuff coming out reminded me exactly of the FBI, because they were obsessed with protecting the institution. They didn't care about the wreckage of individual lives. So Cardinal Law didn't care that little boys were raped and committed suicide, because the church, the institution, was so important and did such great work. And the FBI didn't care that Michael Dunnigan was murdered on the waterfront in '82, and his sons and his wife were wrecked, because the FBI is a great institution, and it's more important than one life or 20 lives. So to me, it's authority, and the sort of arrogance of authority is at the heart of a lot of this stuff. And I think Billy Bulger had mostly a free ride and all this stuff. That said, I think some people have gone over the top and made unsupported accusations. Shelley and I did a Chris Lydon's radio show, the web show. He said we went easy on Billy Bulger. And I said, I don't think we went easy on him, but I also don't think we were gratuitous. I think people are intelligent enough to read that book and come to their own conclusions. And I certainly came to the conclusion that Billy Bulger and his entire family enabled Whitey. And that, as I said in the piece in the magazine, one question we'll never be able to answer is, what if, when I described that Whitey got back into the criminal life after Billy tried to give him a legitimate life, what if Billy said to him, hey, as long as you're in that life, you can't be in ours? What would Whitey have done? Now, I personally don't think Whitey could have survived without the succor and the support of his family. But it was never withheld. It was never conditional. He was welcomed at every family function. He was always around the house. They named their kids after him.
Well, even during the trial, the brothers were showing up, or...
Jackie showed up. We all think that means he knows where the money is. Because believe me, the $822,000 was in the wall in Santa Monica. That ain't all. Whitey would have stashed money. He would have known someday he came home to that apartment in Santa Monica where he hid out for 15 years. And that if the apartment was surrounded or the thing, he would have moved somewhere else and there would have been money elsewhere. He didn't keep everything there. So there's money. I mean, the estimate, and I think it's kind of out of thin air, but the government estimates that Whitey made about $25 million in his criminal career. Now, we know it was testified to how much money he was making. In the 80s, he was getting $10,000 a week just for the cocaine ring that he had. And, he did live a sort of Spartan life. He didn't throw a lot of money around. That was part of his genius. But I think there's millions out there. And Jackie hasn't told me where it is.
Hi, Kevin. It's really great to hear you tonight.
Thank you.
I grew up in Massachusetts, and I've read your column for years. And I think you just wrote a column on police PTSD or police suicide.
Yeah, that kid Pat Rogers from Boston's Finest killed himself 2 weeks ago.
It's a shame, but I wanted to thank you for writing that piece.
Thank you.
It was very well done and very, very much needed. But my question today is, I've read a lot of books on the subject, and one thing that I was hoping you could clarify for me is, I just finished reading Casey Sherman's book, Animal, and he talks about Paul Rico, and I believe his partner's name was Dennis Condon. And what I couldn't figure out was, were they involved with Whitey Bulger before Conley? And if not, does any of your research indicate whether, for lack of a better term, they were dirty or not?
Yeah, well, we believe they were both corrupt in the terms that they were getting people killed. When I was describing the FBI getting people killed in the 1960s, I was speaking in generalities, but very specifically, Paul Rico and Dennis Condon were running people, and particularly Paul Rico. Well, he was the guy that when Buddy McLean murdered, Paul Rico set his own informant up to be killed. And then Buddy hung out in Paul Rico's house until the coast was clear. There's no doubt that those guys were involved in a number of things, but it was more specific to Steve Fleming, and he was Whitey's criminal partner through much of his latter career. Steve Fleming was recruited as an informant in the 60s by Paul Rico. And actually was, and we go into it in some great detail in the book, that Fleming was on the wrong side of the gang war in the 60s, and basically Rico, and to a lesser extent Condon, said, you got to go on to this other team. You need to get with Winter Hill, because they're going to win. And the reason they're going to win is we decide who wins. And so, you know, Fleming was an informant, and then he actually tried to kill, you mentioned Animal, that's the nickname for Joe Barboza, who was one of the first high-profile turncoats on the Mafia in Boston. He testified against Mafia guys. He actually lied about almost everything he said. He was putting enemies away, and he was a bad guy. But when Barboza was testifying against the Mafia decided to kill his lawyer, John Fitzgerald, whose brother Joe was a sports writer at the Herald. So John gets blown up by Stevie Fleming and Frank Salemi. And then Rico says, they're going to indict you, you get a stroke. So then Fleming and Rico, Fleming, boy, these Italian names. Fleming and Salemi go on the run. And then they're out on the run for a number of years, and then, Rico he does two things. Him and Condon Fleming gives up Salemi, who's in New York, and John Conley, the young agent from Southie, walking down Fifth Avenue, bumps into Frank Salemi, most wanted, gangster in Boston, arrests him, gets promoted and brought back to Boston. And then they call Fleming and say, the coast is clear. We got the informant, the witness against you in the bombing to not cooperate. So Fleming comes back, and so now Fleming returns. Whitey's already established in the Winter Hill gang, and they become partners. And they become partners through the FBI. John Conley says to Whitey, get Fleming to talk to me. And Fleming talked at great length. We have all of his debriefing papers with the DEA and state police, in which he says he thought it was weird that Whitey wanted him to talk to another FBI agent. Then he realized that Whitey was trying to put him in a compromising position so that Conley would know he was an informant, and Conley already knew that Rico would use him as an informant. So Fleming felt like he had to be an informant. He had to continue this relationship. And Fleming, this is the interesting thing, Whitey was not a good informant on the Italians. The Italians respected him in a weird kind of way, but would not tell him if his pants were on fire. But Fleming was an Italian, and the Mafia had recruited him a number of times, asking him to come over. He said, nah, I don't really want to do it, but he stayed close to them. He provided very important information to the FBI, which led to the indictments in '83 and other. But Whitey was just like a phony informant. That's why when he got up during his trial and said, I really wasn't an informant, he wasn't actually lying. But he did give up information, particularly on guys in South Boston. We saw his entire informant. It's over 700 pages. And he gave up a lot of guys in Southie. And the way he said, nobody was prosecuted on my information, so I'm not an informant. But he's splitting hairs. He's very good at sophistry. I don't think he can spell sophistry.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Just to kind of follow up on that, was the FBI then influential in helping him to stay hidden while he was, for about 18 years?
Yeah,
or something?
that's a good question, because that comes up, was the FBI. Well, the way we explain it in the book is that the first 2 years when, it's like anything, the first year to 2 years when somebody goes on the run, that's your best chance to get them. In those first 2 years, the FBI didn't find him because they weren't looking for him. The FBI, in its infinite wisdom, assigned the search for him after he absconded to the very organized crime squad he corrupted. So all these guys that was having dinner with him, taking money from him, taking Christmas gifts, Nick Gianturco got like all these gifts from him, and his brother Charlie was in charge of the search. Oh yeah, that should work out well. So they weren't looking for him. And one of the best examples we show is, Whitey had, we talk about narrative arcs in the book. He had many women in his life. He was, unbelievable. First of all, he was a misogynist. He didn't like women. He used women. There's a big difference. He had two important women in his life. Teresa Stanley, who he became more or less a, common law husband with in the mid-'60s, and then Kathy Gregg, who's was his girlfriend for 20 years while he was still going out with Teresa. And Teresa didn't know about Kathy, but Kathy knew about Teresa. We have this crazy scene when they finally find out about each other, and oh my God, right out of the movies. And then Whitey takes off, but he takes Teresa with him because he feels guilty that Teresa really was his longest-serving girlfriend. Blah, blah. About a month on the run, Teresa goes, I don't want to do this. Bring me home. So he drops Teresa off, picks Kathy up, seeing out of Casablanca. It's like turning in the 94 for 98, and he goes off, and Kathy was absolutely just thrilled to finally be selected because she felt like the other woman and wanted to be. And she was a very educated woman. She went to Northeastern University, was teaching at the Forsyth Dental School. And Teresa was not educated. She was a Southie girl. She was a very nice person, actually. She cooperated and helped us an awful lot with the book and unfortunately died a couple of years ago. Very nice person, but she was sort of clueless about what Whitey was about and what he was doing. Kathy was much more aware. Whitey murdered two of her brothers-in-law. She was married to Bobby McGonigal, a Boston firefighter, who was both Donnie, wrong guy shot in the head, and Paulie buried in the sand. Those were Bobby's brothers. And she knew when she hooked up with Whitey that he had murdered her brothers-in-law. But, she apparently didn't like her in-laws. So then, I'm sorry, where am I going with this? What was the question again?
How did you stay hidden?
Staying hidden. Now, Teresa was back. I saw Teresa about 2 weeks after she got back. And I said, where's Jimmy? She goes, oh, I don't know. And, all right. So anyway, we find out when we're doing the research here that the FBI did not interview Teresa until 14 months after she came back. So, because they didn't want to know what she might tell them. Because she would have told them, as she did when they interviewed her 14 months later, what his alias was. Thomas Baxter, the guy that was killed young in Woburn, Massachusetts. Whitey kept that ID in his pocket for 15 years, knowing someday he would use it. And she was with him when he was Thomas Baxter. He was Thomas Baxter for the first 2 years on the run. But by the time the FBI got onto him, Teresa felt bad after she told the FBI. She told Kevin Weeks, his henchman. Kevin tells Whitey on the run, you got to lose that ID. And so the FBI doesn't get him, but they weren't looking for him. And by the time that the FBI, and from the very beginning in '97, when they assigned, when Judge Wolf forced them to admit that he was their informant, something the Globe had reported 9 years previously, the FBI assigned assigned the case to the very squad he corrupted. And I put a big story at the front page of the Globe saying how it's a ridiculous conflict of interest, that they shouldn't be in charge. The FBI was so arrogant, and nobody's in charge of them. Like the U.S. Attorney should be able to say, this is wrong, you can't do this, but they can't. The U.S. Attorney, Wayne Budd, in 1994, which again, 6 years after we exposed Whitey as an informant, the U.S. Attorney sat down with the FBI and said, is he your informant? And they go, we can't tell you. That's how absurd this is. And so by the time they finally were under pressure, particularly after Judge Wolf got involved, they assigned it to a multi-agency task force. The trail had gone cold. But the FBI never relinquished control of the investigation. And the one critical thing, if you read the book, they would not bring they would not bring the Marshal Service in. Because the Marshals know how to find fugitives. That's what they do. They would not allow them in. And as we kind of explained at the end of the book, one dramatic change, they brought in a young marshal named Neil Sullivan, grew up on the Cape. This is what he does for a living. He used to do it in New York. He's brought back home. Let's go find Bulger. And he did it with another FBI agent named Phil Torsey. There were two of them. It's up, most of the time there were 15, 20 people, 12 people on this task force. By the time they finally caught him, there were 2 of them. And they caught him because they were actually looking for him.
What was the source of Billy Bulger's influence on Bob Drinan and John McCormick?
The source of the, well, Billy was just a freshman. He was a first-year law student. But you have to remember, Bob Drinan was very, he had a number of issues he was very passionate about, and prison reform was one of them. He actually did a lot of good stuff when he was in Congress about that. So he had a soft spot for inmates, for prisoners. So it wasn't a stretch for him to get involved in that. Now, we found there was a Drinan family that lived in the same building on Logan Way in the project, but I found Drinan's sister-in-law and his niece, and they said that had nothing to do with them. That as far they were surprised, they didn't know. The sister-in-law did know because she said that Bob would, he had dinner every Sunday with them. The sister-in-law was married to a doctor, Bob's brother Frank, and they lived not too far from the BC campus in Chestnut Hill, and they would have dinner every Sunday. And she said that Bob would always go off about, oh, that Whitey Bulger, what a pain in the ass he is. I put my reputation out there, and he was just wanted to be a hood. But what I thought was very intriguing is when Shelley called me from, she was out in Alcatraz, then she went to San Bruno. She goes, you won't believe what I just found. I said, Bob Drinan was his parole advisor. I go, wow. I go, I'm going to BC. I literally jumped in the car at the Globe, drove out to Boston College, and go through this very formal procedure going into the O'Neill, the Burns Library at Boston College, where all their papers are. And I knew Bob Drinan had given his papers there. I went through all his papers. There was only one letter in there that referred to Whitey. And it was Whitey writing to him. He had pulled all the other letters. And I know that because Sanford Katz, who was one of Bob's closest friends at BC Law School, said, he told me after, he was stunned too. He said, Bob never would have left those. He goes, he pulled those letters. They're gone. He wouldn't want that in his file. Then I went down to Washington, went through all the Georgetown stuff, same thing. Bob had pulled all that stuff. Now the McCormick thing, like McCormick was very friendly with the family. Like he was the local representative, and he knew everybody, and he knew old Mr. Bulger. And in the letters we saw that he wrote to the director of the Bureau of Prisons and said, he comes from, meaning Whitey, comes from a very good family. His father is an old friend of mine. He was just a constituent, so. Billy was no dummy.
It's somewhat of a peculiar story with the Brattleboro connection. I was walking to the post office one day, and a man spotted me on the other side of the street and came across the street and said, "You're Whitey's friend, aren't you?" With a Southern accent. And I said, "Who?" And he said, "Whitey." And he insisted that we had eaten with Whitey together in a restaurant. I tried to assure them there was nothing to the story. And he also asked me if I knew where Whitey was. So this is kind of cool.
How long ago was this?
I'm going to say 5 years ago or
Wow.
something. And he approached me a second time, again with the same sort of thing. And so that's why I have this kind of strange connection to Whitey Bulger. But it was kind of very weird anyway. But that's it.
Well, I mean, that's why there were so many sightings of him. I mean, seriously, I mean, I always found it amusing, though, the FBI, and I wrote a column about this, there was a sighting in Sicily, they jump off to Sicily, there was a sighting in London, there's never a sighting in Montenegro, or Kosovo, or Lowell, it's like, so it's beautiful. Now, there's a guy that I know that he's a member of the Garda Síochána, which is the Irish National Police. I've known him for 25 years. And he is the liaison, so when the FBI lands at Shannon in Ireland, he has to pick them up and drive them around or whatever. He came into Boston about, 5 or 6 years ago. I said, "Joe," "what's the deal?" I said, "The FBI always goes over there like once a year looking for Whitey." I go, "Is there ever like a really serious sighting? Did they ever like get anything?" He goes, "Not really, but they always bring their clubs." There's good golfing in the west of Ireland.
I was just curious if you'd ever felt threatened or that you needed protection, or because it sounds like you were pretty close to a lot of pretty dangerous people.
Just that thing just that thing I mentioned with the, when the FBI said I'd be killed. But but no, I mean, no, like I said, it was, when I look back now, actually I was wrong when I said he wouldn't kill me, because he killed a legitimate businessman, a millionaire in Oklahoma, so why wouldn't he kill a scumbag like me? But I don't think I would have been that missed. So, in hindsight, yeah, the funny thing is I never told my wife the full extent of the whole thing until, like, that went over well. If you knew Bad Martha. I didn't want to scare her. And I just said, you know, I said, Dad, some of you might break windows or something, we have to go, and blah, blah, blah. So, and then, like, years later, there was the anniversary of the Spotlight team, the investigative team, and they were talking about the different things we did. And one of the old editors said, who could forget the courage of Kevin and Martha under their lives under threat? And she looks at me like, you're an asshole. I'm sorry, is that going on in, like, local cable?
They'll run it a little later at night, you know, once the kids are in bed. You mentioned that it was estimated that Whitey was pulling in about $10,000 a week for the cocaine.
On the coke stuff. That would be in
What
the
years
80s.
were those?
That would have been, Billy Shea testified that. He would have said the early to mid-80s.
Okay.
And that went on for quite a while.
And what do you think he had for, like, market share of the area? No, I'm serious. This question's going to go somewhere.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, they had Billy. The funny thing is, when Billy testified to that, the follow-up question was, well, how much were you pulling in a week? And Billy says, well, we pulling in about 100 grand a week. And he goes, oh, Jesus, Jimmy, Jimmy's going to think I'm a jerk because I was only giving him 10 and we were making 100. And so, I mean, that was a lot of money. But and I lived there during the time. And this was one of the other things. But Whitey, and particularly his family, and particularly Bill, spent an awful lot of time propagating the myth that Whitey kept drugs out of South Boston. Now, Southie had an actually disproportionate amount of drug abuse, disproportionate number of suicides. A lot of them involved in kids that were messed up on drugs. I'm sure a lot of it was, you know, mental illness, bipolar, a lot of that stuff, but that combination was very, very bad. I had a number of cousins that got involved in that crap. It was just bad in Southie. And on more than one occasion, because when I went from the Herald to the Globe in '85, I really started digging into the drug stuff and writing what the cops I knew were telling me, is that Whitey was involved in drugs. And on more than one occasion, Billy Bulger came up to me, and I got along with him. He was my rep. I voted for him. And he went like this. He goes, you're saying that's a lie. My brother would never be involved in drugs. And then in the trial, frankly, most of what came out in the trial, I had known. I had known the whole thing. But the one thing that was shocking is that Bulger's own defense lawyer, Jay Carney, got up and said he made millions from the drug trade. He bragged about it. But it was a tactical decision by Bulger to say that I was involved. The only thing he cared about, he was charged with 19 murders. He only cared about 2 of them, the women. I did not kill women. And he didn't, and I wasn't a rat. And he wasn't even charged with that. He spent most of his defense saying I'm not an informant, and he wasn't even charged with it. But that's why he admitted to the drugs, because he knew there was going to be a parade of drug dealers. It was like Saturday Night Live. It was all these like brain damaged guys from Southie who go, yeah, we're selling drugs. They were all whacked. They're all like these, and I knew them. I knew a lot of these guys from the gin mills in the '80s. You knew who these guys were, and they all, and he knew, Whitey knew that I'll admit to this, that, and that, so they might give me the benefit of doubt on the only things I care about. I didn't kill the women, and he did kill the women, and I wasn't an informant, and he was an informant, and he was a drug dealer. This is how pathetic it was. After it was about the 10th or 11th drug dealer that got up and said, yeah, Whitey got me involved in drugs, and I sold drugs from him and all this stuff. And Jay Carney said it, he said it to Paul Moore, who we used to call, his nickname was Polecat. But Mr. Moore, he would not be involved in heroin or angel dust, would he? No, he wouldn't. And he wouldn't sell it to children, would he? No, he wouldn't. No further questions, Your Honor. I'm like, wow, what a great guy.
Since Whitey's not, the main marketer, nowadays, who runs the cocaine trade in Boston? Is it something the Globe wants to look into? I mean,
No, there's coke everywhere.
Yeah,
I mean,
there
there's-
is.
but
I just
heroin's
wonder, when
actually-
you think about a guy who's
heroin's a-
protected by the FBI and he brings in that much money in coke.
Well, I think a lot of drug dealers are protected by government
Yeah.
agents.
Yeah.
It's like, that's the whole idea, who becomes your informant? And who can he give up? The problem with Whitey is they lost the plot. He was the worst guy in Boston, and they were protecting him. But like I said, I think they do it, I think the FBI is worse at this, but I think other law enforcement agencies, if a cop will say, he's my rat, he's okay, because they're trying to make that next case. But I think, like I said, I think the Massachusetts State Police in particular get it right. They know once the guy, I know cops that have prosecuted their own informants. And the informants get up and say, hey, I work, it's dodgy because they'll say it in camera, they won't say it in public, because if you say I'm a rat and I should be released, they know if they lose, they're going to can, and you don't want to go in the can saying you're a rat. So, but like I said, it's the worst part of law enforcement, especially involved in the drug trade, because usually when you nail somebody, you can always offer somebody higher, but you don't even know if they're telling the truth. They're all scumbags, they're all drug dealers and liars.
I just didn't know whether it's more of a, is it an ethnic thing that they protected the
There was
you know what I
definitely
mean?
an Irish
Because
angle.
Irish
There was definitely an Irish
or
angle
if
to
it
this.
was just, corrupt money. You know what I mean?
No, I mean, there was definitely an Irish thing in
More of an
Boston.
Irish thing.
And most of the agents were Irish, so Nick Gianturco obviously was Italian, but I always said he was, Nick was Irish by osmosis.
So right up here, sir.
Yes, sir.
A couple of years ago, you wrote a column about a guy named Tommy Burns from Cambridge who had died of cancer, I think about age 60. And he was the guy I went to high school with. So I wanted to thank you for that column.
Oh,
It was
thank
really
you.
Good. You also mentioned another guy from Brighton, Jimmy Carr, who's the Boston
Carr?
Police.
Great guy, great cop.
You had mentioned him in relation to somebody who stood up against Bulger.
Frank DeWan, Jimmy Carr, and Kenny Beers were the three Boston cops that stuck with it longer. And like I said, Frank suffered actual, almost career-ending stuff because of his involvement, but Jimmy Carr was aces, absolutely. Those guys, like I said, there are so many bad people. We tend to forget that there were very good people that brought this to a fruition, and Jimmy is definitely one of them. He was aces, really nice man. I knew him when I was a really young reporter. He was a very nice police officer. You get to know who the good cops are.
Just wanted to know what would be the chances of him getting solitary? You know how it's very common
Oh, yeah.
now for people to get solitary. It's usually the disenfranchised. And the other question, what are the chances of him committing suicide?
I'll take it backwards. I don't think he'll commit suicide. I think he's too mean to die right now. But it's interesting what you say about the solitary part of it. I think he will get solitary because he's an informant. And that's sort of the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, anybody that's even suspected of being an informant, there's almost an obligation to segregate them from the rest of the population. Because an informant generally would be the person that would be most likely to be shivved or hurt. So that's the irony. But I also know that, that's up to the Bureau of Prisons to decide. That Judge Casper, I thought, was absolutely brilliant. That one of the greatest parts of this, Whitey fought like hell to get rid of Rick Stearns, who I actually wrote. He was the initial judge for the case. And Whitey filed a motion saying he has a conflict of interest. He's like best friends with the FBI director, Bob Mueller. He was a prosecutor in the office when they were protecting him. And I actually agreed with, it's probably the only time I ever agreed with Whitey Bulger. I didn't think he should be the judge. I thought he had, at the very least, an appearance of a conflict. But so that was a Pyrrhic victory for Whitey, because what happened? Denise Casper is assigned the case. Denise Casper is not only the youngest federal judge in Boston, she's the first African-American woman to sit on the federal bench in Boston. And Whitey is not just a serial killer, he's a racist and a misogynist. And every day he had to sit up there and look at this accomplished African-American woman and say, "Sit down, Mr. Bulger." It was awesome. And I must say, that at the end of that case, I thought she was because she really did a good job. That's a hard case. She might not ever get, in the rest of her career, as high-profile a case as that. And I thought she did a terrific job. Defense lawyers will say she sided with the prosecution too much. She didn't allow Whitey to present his defense, which was actually so ridiculous. I actually thought they should have let him present it. He said that some prosecutor who was conveniently dead had said, "You can kill anybody you want, because not because you're an informant, but we just think you're a great guy." Yeah, sure, okay. But let me just finish this. And so Denise Casper really was the epitome of judicial restraint and equanimity, and that blindfold across. And the blindfold slipped during the sentencing, and she let him have it. But she sentenced him more, I think she spoke more with astonishment than contempt. And she talked about, one of the victims, Pat Donahue, said to me, she goes, "It's like she was channeling us. She spoke for us." And she was terrific. She just nailed him. She said, she talked about, you talk about how intelligent you are. It doesn't take intelligence to stick a gun in somebody's mouth and take their money. She said everything you did was basically for money, which makes it even more heinous. She said that, that your crimes were almost unfathomable. She was just terrific. So she hit every note perfectly. And yet she never came across as overbearing or overzealous, I just thought she was terrific. And it's not even, like I said, it's not what I think. I talked to a number of the victims after, and they just, I thought Pat Donahue said, she goes, "I love Judge Casper." It's awesome. Yeah, I guess you get the last up there. You're not going to throw anything at me, are you?
My question is just really a yes or no. Do you ever feel that now that your life is in danger in any way because the FBI is still doing the same thing? And, maybe there's somebody going to get out to help you after you someday?
No, I don't think so. The person I'm most afraid of right now is my wife. Because this book tour won't end. And she has been very long-suffering. And like I said, she's a wonderful person who puts up with a slightly less wonderful person. But no, I'm pretty cool. I might even go down to the firehouse and have a McNeil's before I head home. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Can I sign here? Thank you.